Most people spend hundreds, sometimes even thousands, optimizing the wrong thing for longevity. Supplements, biomarker tracking, the latest protocols. But when I reviewed 73 studies on longevity interventions, the data revealed something counterintuitive. The interventions that have the strongest evidence base are completely free, and for some, almost nobody prioritizes them. I'm Dr. Carl. I spent 7 years working as a doctor in the NHS before transitioning full-time into longevity medicine. My background is in academic medicine and ENT surgery, which means I can interpret the research, understand its limitations, and translate it into something that you can actually use. My goal for this channel is to make the medical literature accessible so you can really make informed decisions about your health. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 7 evidence-based longevity interventions. For each one, I'll show you what the research shows, what the mechanisms are, and exactly how to implement it. Stay tuned because some of these findings may surprise you. With that framework in place, we can examine the interventions themselves, and the first one has one of the largest effect sizes in all of longevity research. This intervention is physical activity, but the research reveals something that most people miss. Researchers tracked 36,000 individuals using accelerometers, which are devices that objectively measure your every movement. They looked at participants' data every day for years, after which the participants were then divided into 4 groups based on their total sedentary time. And what shocked me was that the most sedentary group had a 2.63 times mortality risk compared to those who sat still the least. And this association was independent of other measured variables. The research seemed to suggest that up to 8 hours of sitting per day, the risk increase was only modest, but beyond 8 hours, the mortality risk accelerated sharply. Think of sedentary behavior as a physiological stressor. When you sit for long periods of time, metabolic rate decreases, glucose clearance becomes less efficient, and over time this drives insulin resistance and systemic inflammation. In simple terms, prolonged stillness is metabolically toxic. Now, here's the positive counterpart. A systematic review examined physical activity trajectories throughout adulthood to determine patterns over decades. Individuals who were consistently active or increasingly active over their adult life demonstrated a 20 to 40% lower all-cause mortality risk. Notice the pattern, consistency. The benefit comes from sustained movement over time, not heroic bursts of effort followed by prolonged inactivity. But I hear you asking, what does consistent movement actually look like? Well, a meta-analysis of 227,000 participants examined steps per day and mortality. The findings were pretty clear. Benefits began at just 2,500 to 4,000 steps per day, and every 1,000 step increase reduced mortality by 15%. Optimal range is between 6,000 and 8,000 steps for adults over the age of 60 and 8,000 to 10,000 steps for younger adults. And here is the most important finding. Any activity, regardless of the intensity, was associated with a lower mortality risk. Even light physical activity, so walking, household chores, gentle movements, had significant positive effects. You don't need to train for a marathon. You simply need to get up and move. Now, the second intervention is one almost nobody prioritizes when thinking about longevity. Social connection. A meta-analysis of 148 studies encompassing over 300,000 participants found that stronger social relationships increase survival odds by 50%. If a pharmaceutical company could replicate this effect, it would be one of the most valuable drugs in all of human history. There is a super important distinction here, and understanding it matters for planning intervention. Loneliness is the subjective experience of being alone, the feeling of isolation, regardless of how many people you have around you. It increases mortality risk by 26%. Social isolation, on the other hand, is the objective lack of social contacts. Fewer relationships, less frequent interactions. It increases mortality risk by 29%. Both are harmful, but they are entirely different constructs. You can feel lonely in a crowd, but you can also be socially isolated and psychologically content. The mechanisms differ. Loneliness activates stress pathways and inflammatory responses, whilst isolation reduces social support and health-promoting behaviours. In practical terms, this means that addressing loneliness requires improving the quality of relationships, not just merely increasing their quantity. One particularly effective strategy for building meaningful social connection is volunteering. A study of 75,000 people over the age of 50 in the UK found that volunteering reduced mortality risk by 22%. Volunteering creates social bonds that provides a sense of purpose and facilitates community integration. These psychological benefits translate into measurable physiological effects: reduced inflammation, improved cardiovascular function, and lower stress hormone levels. It's one of the most practical ways to build meaningful relationships into your routine. The third intervention, and coincidentally my favourite activity to do, is sleep. But most people misunderstand what the data is actually showing. They focus exclusively on duration and they assume that more is always better. The research demonstrates something that's a little bit more complex than this. A meta-analysis of 1.38 million participants found a U-shaped relationship between sleep duration and mortality. Short sleep, less than 7 hours, had a 12% increased mortality, but long sleep, more than 9 hours, had a 30% increased mortality. Both extremes are associated with harm, and the association with long sleep is actually stronger. My theory, though, is that this may reflect underlying illness. People who are unwell for some other reason tend to sleep more, and so this can act as a co-founder, influencing the results. But it could also indicate that excessive sleep disrupts circadian biology. In any regard, the optimal range appears to be between 7 and 9 hours, which is commonly what you hear. That finding is consistent across multiple large cohort studies. But here's where the research becomes even more interesting. The Salento regional study in southern Italy examined exceptional longevity clusters. So these are areas where individuals routinely live past the age of 100. Researchers compared these centenarians to younger matched controls to try and identify distinguishing characteristics. What differentiated them was not just sleep duration, but it was things like keeping a strict sleep-wake schedule, so going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time each morning, and getting superior slow-wave sleep, so that deep sleep where you're actively recovering. So you can really think of sleep quality as a marker for overall physiological regulation. When your circadian rhythms are consistent and your sleep architecture is intact, your metabolic, cardiovascular, and immune systems function more efficiently. Conversely, irregular sleep disrupts these systems even if the total duration is adequate. In simple terms, it's not only how much sleep you get, it's the quality and consistency of that sleep too. And here is a free Dr. Cal approved intervention: morning light exposure. Research demonstrates that for every 30-minute of sunlight exposure before 10 a.m., you get 23-minute earlier sleep onset that evening. The mechanism for this makes sense. Bright light exposure in the morning advances your circadian clock, making it easier to fall asleep in the evening. This improves sleep quality and supports regular sleep-wake timing. Get outside in the morning, it costs absolutely nothing and the effect is measurable. Now we're moving on to the fourth intervention, and it's thermal exposure. Most people think of the sauna and cold exposure as recovery tools, useful for muscle soreness perhaps, but not essential for longevity. But the data would suggest otherwise. The Finnish sauna study is one of the longest running cohort studies on thermal exposure. Research here followed over 2,000 middle-aged men for over 20 years, and they tracked sauna frequency and cardiovascular outcomes. Compared to men using the sauna once per week, those that used it 4 to 7 times a week had a 63% lower risk of sudden cardiac death and a 40% lower all-cause mortality, which is a pretty impressive effect size. So what is actually happening physiologically during thermal stress? Well, 3 primary mechanisms have been identified. Heat shock protein activation. These are your cellular repair proteins that refold damaged proteins and protect against age-related cellular damage. Heat stress upregulates their production, so you can think of heat shock proteins as your cellular maintenance crew. They clean up damaged proteins before they aggregate and cause dysfunction. Cardiovascular conditioning. During sauna exposure, your heart rate can increase from normal up to 120 to 150 beats per minute, similar to moderate exercise. With this, cardiac output can increase by up to 70%, and this trains the cardiovascular system without the mechanical loading of exercise. And while this is not a replacement, it offers a good adjunct to any training routine, especially around injuries or other busy life periods. Inflammation reduction. So repeated sauna use lowers systemic inflammatory markers such as CRP and interleukin-6. Chronic low-grade inflammation drives many age-related diseases, and reducing it has broad protective effects. Moving on to cold exposure, the mechanism is different but complementary. Recent research demonstrates that 7-day cold water acclimation enhances autophagic activity. Think of this as your cellular self-destruct process. Damaged cells clear themselves away, helping to reduce inflammatory signaling and improve insulin sensitivity. Another cool aspect of this combination of heat and cold, it creates a hormetic stress response. Hormesis is the principle that mild stresses, which aren't enough to cause harm, actually trigger adaptive responses to make you more resilient as an individual. In practical terms, your body adapts to these extreme hot and cold temperatures and becomes stronger because of that. Now, this is where the research challenges conventional longevity advice. The fifth intervention is stress management, and here's what most people underestimate. Damage from stress does not come from dramatic events. Things like losing a job, a major illness, or a life crisis. These are acute stresses with a clear endpoint. The real harm comes from chronic, daily accumulation of minor stresses, and the biological damage doesn't appear immediately. It takes years. Researchers followed adults for 10 years, and at baseline they measured daily stresses, so things like minor annoyances, interpersonal conflicts, time pressures, and then measured their emotional reactivity, how strongly that individual reacted to the stressor. A decade later, they then looked at participants' allostatic load. Allostatic load is how stress impacted their biological systems, and you can think of it like a composite biomarker, encompassing things like blood pressure, cardiovascular markers, metabolic markers, inflammatory markers, and stress hormones. The finding: those more stressed at baseline showed consistent physical decline 10 years later. And here's the critical detail: the association was only significant in older adults. Why, I hear you ask? There are two plausible explanations. First, younger adults have a greater physiological resilience. They can buffer against daily stress without measurable biological damage. Second, cumulative stress load becomes toxic over time. Years of chronic stress eventually overwhelm recovery systems. Either way, the implication is clear. Stress management becomes more critical as you age, not less. Now, what interventions can actually improve resilience? The evidence points to aerobic exercise, so doing around 300 minutes or more per week. Slow breathing, so trying to reduce your breaths per minute down intentionally to shift autonomic balance. Adequate sleep, maintaining 7 to 9 hour balance we talked about earlier. And meditation and mindful practice has also shown to be beneficial. Notice how these interventions overlap with one another. That's not coincidental. The interventions are synergistic and they compound together. The sixth intervention is another obvious one, and it's nutrition. But here is where the research is conflicting. On one side, you've got animal studies that consistently demonstrate that lower protein intake extends lifespan. The mechanism for this involves suppression of the mTORC1, a nutrient sensing pathway. When mTORC1 is chronically activated, which occurs during high protein intake, it accelerates cellular aging. Therefore, less protein should equal longer lifespan. But in humans, and particularly older adults, maintaining muscle mass is critical for longevity. And to maintain muscle, you need protein, specifically 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight for older adults who are resistance training. If you don't eat enough protein, you do lose muscle. There's the paradox. Low protein suppresses mTORC1, which may extend lifespan at the cellular level, and high protein preserves muscle, which reduces frailty and mortality risk at the whole body level. So what do? It's impossible to optimize for both simultaneously. The solution is not to choose one strategy permanently, but cycle between them. Most of the time, eat adequate protein intake. Maintain muscle with 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this is particularly important around resistance training periods. Then periodically restrict protein intake using short periods of fasting mimicking diets. These promote autophagy, which, as you remember from before, is cellular cleanup. This limits the potentially harmful effect of prolonged mTOR activation whilst allowing you to maintain muscle mass during normal feeding periods. This approach allows you to access the longevity pathway without chronic muscle loss. You can alternate between building and clearing. The seventh and final intervention is cognitive challenge, and it matters for longevity because cognitive decline is a mortality predictor. Studies demonstrate that cognitive impairment significantly increases all-cause mortality independent of other health conditions. Why though? Because cognitive decline is linked with a reduced ability to make healthy decisions, decreased physical activity, social withdrawal, and medication non-compliance. It's a cascade. But the good news, the aging brain maintains substantial capacity for neuroplastic change. A 13-week cognitive training study in older adults found significant improvements in attention and working memory. It turns out you can teach an old brain new tricks, but you've got to challenge it. Another key insight from the study was that cognitive training was domain specific. If you train attention, you improve attention. If you train memory, you improve memory. If you train executive function, well, you improve executive function. You improve what you specifically practice. So, what qualifies as a cognitive challenge? It can be things like learning a new language or instrument, complex strategy games, structured memory training programs. If it's easy, it's not training your brain. So after looking at all of those interventions, the evidence becomes clear. Those that matter most for longevity are the common sense fundamentals that you are already aware of. Importantly, these interventions are not independent. Physical activity improves sleep, sleep improves stress resilience, social connection supports cognitive function. They are all synergistic with one another. Like I said, my goal with this channel is to make the medical literature accessible so you can make genuinely informed decisions about your health. If you found this useful, subscribing helps us reach more people, and if there's a topic that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments below. I've put together all 73 studies referenced in this video into a citation library. It's free and you can access it in the link in the description below. Plus, if you want to go deeper on why muscle mass is critical for longevity, I made an entire video on that topic and I'll link it somewhere around here. Until next time, look after yourselves.